Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November Lunch and Learn for the Florida Native Plant Society. Um, I'm very sorry we had to switch presenters. Owen Schneider had a family emergency, so he's not available to present today, but he's interested in rescheduling, so I'll let you guys know when we can get that rescheduled. So fortunately, I have a number of presentations that we've recorded at various conferences, and so I went through all of our repository of content, and I found the Ferns of Florida presentation by James Stevenson, a very engaging presentation from 2023 about at our conference about the Ferns of Florida, a great overview. And so Susan was the treasurer. Susan introduces him at this particular conference, which was unfortunately online. We were still doing online conferences through 2023. And so she was the treasurer. She's not FNPS treasurer anymore. She stepped down so that she could become the president of our Alachua County chapter, which is Paynes Prairie chapter. So, and at the end, we have a little cameo by our then executive director, Linda Davis, who left us to move to the United Kingdom. So, and you'll see at the end that James answered questions at our conference platform because we had to move on to the next presenter. But of course, I will be watching the presentation with you guys and able to answer a few questions, hopefully, that you might have. So yeah, please feel free to email questions to me if you're not logged into Google/YouTube. I know some people don't like to log in, and so that's totally acceptable. communications@fnps.org. And so, yeah, without further ado, I'll get his presentation going. Please enjoy.
Hello, I'm Susan Carr. I'm a member of the Florida Native Plant Society and on the board. I'm the treasurer. And it's my pleasure today to introduce to you James Stevenson for the presentation on ferns of Florida. And I'm pretty excited about this topic because I don't know a whole lot about ferns, so I'm going to take notes. Jim Stevenson is an extension specialist with the University of Florida, IFAS Extension in Pinellas County. He works at the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center in Tarpon Springs, and he teaches classes on a variety of natural resource topics, including plant identification, botany, entomology, ecology, and native plants, such as ferns. James grew up in Clearwater and then went to the University of Tennessee, where he worked in botanic gardens throughout the Southeast, including North Carolina. Then he moved to the United Kingdom and worked at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, and the University of Oxford Botanic Gardens from 1998 to 2006. Since then, James has been with the Pinellas UF IFAS Extension, and he is a botany enthusiast since he was a small child growing up in Peninsular Florida. And his work, his experience has fostered a broad knowledge and appreciation of ecosystems and native floras. Today, James is sharing his knowledge of the ferns of Florida. So without further ado, here is James Stevenson. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm really glad to be with you all today amongst this glittering assemblage of presenters. So thank you to all who have joined us for the Ferns of Florida. I can't improve on that introduction, so we'll just go ahead and carry on. But if you do have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, etc., please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am a public servant. I can be reached, jstevenson@pinellas.gov. I am with the University of Florida, IFAS Extension, not faculty with the university. We are an extension of the university. And if you're not familiar, each county does have an extension of the university in their county, helping people make decisions to improve their lives and to not have a negative impact on anyone else's life or the environment in particular. We are a cooperative with our local government, and we are in charge of looking after, preserving, and educating the public about our natural resources, especially in the little tiny preserve where I reside, Brooker Creek Preserve in the north of Pinellas County. We're 9,000 acres, which sounds big for the smallest county in the state, but by preserve standards, it's pretty tiny. But it is a place where you can find the native plants and animals of Pinellas County, with the exception of the coastal species that are left. The rest of our county is completely built out. A lot of the information for today's presentation comes from the One Concise Guide to the Ferns of Florida, which is still the only place where the knowledge of the ferns of Florida is condensed, a reference and field guide by Gil Nelson, who is not me. Also, some of the photographs are from the Atlas of Vascular Plants, the Institute for Systematic Botany. If this is not a resource that you're familiar with, it's certainly one that you should become familiar with. Every single plant that's ever been found growing naturally, naturalized, native, exotic, invasive, etc., is in this database, which is free and available online, the Florida Plant Atlas. Definitely a resource worth familiarizing yourself with. Today, I would like to I love to start from about 35,000 feet. Let's get an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about ferns. To do that, we will need to familiarize ourselves with the jargon, the terminology that is associated with the discipline of studying ferns. That will lead to some identification techniques. A lot of people will look at ferns and say, all I see is ferns. So my hope is that by familiarizing yourself with the nuances through identification techniques and the terminology, you'll be a little bit more empowered to take on fern identification on your own. And then we'll end up, since Florida is home to the most diverse fern flora in the United States. And since we are kind of constrained by time, we'll go over the 15 fern species that are found here in Central Florida, the wonderful overlap of the temperate panhandle and the tropical South, where you can find a little bit of both. And so we've got the best of both, and we'll just study 15 ferns that you're very likely to encounter no matter where you are in the state. So we'll do this. What is a fern? Like I was mentioning, broad brush strokes, some terminology. We'll go into the different types of leaves that ferns have. That will lead us into the identification and finally some ferns of Central Florida. So what is a fern? We'll start there, just so we're all clear. I like to break down the world, the kingdom, which is slightly out of date terminology, but the sphere of life on Earth that are the plants, as opposed to the animals, the fungus, the single-celled organisms, the bacteria, and so on. We have this world of plants this world of life called the plants. There is within that what I call the big four. There's one group that have no plumbing and they reproduce by spores. They represent some of the very first land plants. These are the mosses. We'll leave those alone. Then we have this slightly more organized, more sophisticated, more specialized group that does have internal plumbing. These are the ferns. Beyond that, in more specialized, we have the conifers, the gymnosperms. And finally, the most highly specialized, the flowering plants. So it kind of falls into these big four. So the ferns, they're vascular plants that reproduce by spores, sharing a common ancestor that bestowed these characters on their descendants and all the living species of fern that are around today. Being put together the same way as defined by that common ancestor, The ferns share a reproductive cycle that is unique to ferns and is crazy. With the certain leaves or section of the leaf modified into spore-producing structures, releasing spores into the world where they germinate and grow into something else, not a fern. That something else then producing sex cells, egg and sperm, you've probably heard of those, that find each other miraculously, that then turn into the next fern. So what makes a fern? Vascular, reproducing by spores, and having this bananas reproductive cycle. These are the things that make a plant a fern. If you were to ask even a child to draw a fern, you would probably get a drawing maybe similar to this, a stylized leaf made of leaflets, triangular blade, and so on. But because of the rules that define what makes a fern, they're not all going to appear like this. There are some species of fern. Here's two different ferns that tick all the boxes of fern biology, and yet they look nothing like what anyone you might ask would sketch as a fern. These happen to be two aquatic species. These are floating on the surface of the water, easily and often mistaken for duckweed, but technically, biologically, these are ferns. So that's what makes a fern. The weird reproductive thing, vascular, differentiated from mosses, doesn't produce cones or flowers, sites us into this nice little compartment of the fern world. What's not a fern? A lot of things that are called ferns, unfortunately, are not. And there are two species of asparagus, maybe you've heard of that, two species of asparagus which have common names that include the word fern, asparagus fern. There's this climbing one, and then there's the clumping asparagus fern. Those are both flowering plants that produce fruit that get into our natural areas. The seeds get into our natural areas. Not only are they not ferns, they happen to be invasive exotic plants in our state. So if you see a plant making flowers or cones, it's not a fern, no matter what it's called. And if you have the asparagus species in your sphere of influence, we would certainly encourage you to do whatever it takes to eradicate it. So in the discipline of studying ferns, we must at least become acquainted with the terminology, the jargon of the ferns, the fern words. And we'll start with frond. Frond, of course, is a word for the leaves of ferns and is shared with an unrelated group of flowering plants. The palms are often referred to as having fronds instead of leaves, but it's just an interchangeable word that technically means leaf. Here we have a sketch of another invasive fern that you might have in your sphere of influence. And again, if you do, please get rid of it, not by sharing it, but by putting it in a black plastic bag and throwing it away. No composting. The tuberous sword fern, but it is here displaying the different parts of a typical fern. The frond, the leaf, the single leaf, is made of a few discernible parts, with the stem often underground, kind of creeping along horizontally, and the stem producing leaves that then break the surface of the soil to unfurl themselves into the sunlight. That leaf is in different sections. The bit of leaf stem that holds the photosynthetic surface up to the sunlight is called the petiole. If any of y'all were in plant identification, I'm sure that's one of the words that came up. The petiole holds the blade, the business part of the fern frond, into the sun. Many ferns have their blade separated into smaller units, leaflets. And in ferns, those leaflets are called pinnae. Pinnae, the singular pinna. I'm not making this up, and I apologize if it's crazy town. In botany, in all of science, we have to name every single part. I'll explain why later. Anyway, back to the construction of a fern frond. We have the petiole holding the blade into the sunlight. The blade is very often divided into little segments that are referred to as pinna that branch off a central, what could be called stem, but that's technically not quite right. But the main vein, as it were, that runs through the blade is referred to as the rachis. Not unique to ferns, the rachis also appears in compound leaves of flowering plants. But here we have a rachis, a petiole, a blade, and pinnae. Roots and stems. Pretty straightforward from there, okay? A simple bladed fern does not have that blade divided into smaller units. That is a simple blade. Here we have a fern with a simple bladed frond. Uninterrupted, unbroken. This is the bird's nest fern, which we don't have in Pinellas County, but can be found in swampy areas growing as an epiphyte. That means using its modified roots to hang on and using that funnel-shaped arrangement of unbroken fronds to kind of concentrate water towards the core or the heart of the crown of this fern. A compound frond, a compound leaf, is one that's divided into these subunits. The subunits are not individual leaves. This is a blade of a single leaf broken into these tiny little individual units, the pinnae, if you'll recall. And when we have pinnae, we have a rachis that the pinnae are attached to. So that is how a compound frond is described. So pinna comes from feather. These leaves, these fronds, are divided like a feather is, where you see the individual little barbules of a feather coming off that central vein, if you will, which is also referred to as the rachis in a feather. The inspiration for the names behind the fern leaf dissection come from this Latin word for feather. Therefore, a frond that is divided such is referred to as pinnate. That is the adjective. Now, I'm not expecting you all to remember all these words. What I'm hoping to do is just to introduce you to these words. So should you decide, perhaps against better judgment, to pursue ferns, these words will not be completely unfamiliar. And a pinnately compound frond will be something that you will at least have heard of once. Because biology is cruel and botany is particularly cruel, sometimes fronds can be divided twice. So not only is one blade divided once, but then a second time into a condition that is referred to as bipinnate or twice compound. We still have the petiole that holds the blade up to the sun. We still have the rachis that is the conduit from which any subdivisions originally branch. But now we have pinnules, second divisions, a bipinnately compound frond. And of course, they can be tripinnate. It just goes on and on. Fern leaves can be divided several times. Just know that this is a thing, and you might be queried as to the nature of a leaf should you choose to be trying to identify an unknown species. And of course, there's a condition that is almost compound. That condition is referred to as pinnatifid. It would be pinnate if it had only finished dividing, represented by a fern, the resurrection fern. The leaf, the frond of a resurrection fern is described as pinnatifid because we have a rachis, but the blade is not divided into discrete little pinnae. It's just very deeply lobed. Okay? Fern words. There are further conditions. A fern frond can be both pinnate, pinnatifid, hyphenated, where the blade itself is divided into subunits. Those subunits are then not fully divided, but instead are pinnatifid. Are you following? So we have one blade divided into pinna, and those pinna are pinnatifid. This is a condition which is found in a lot of the maiden ferns. Now, don't despair. Like I told you, you don't have to be knowing this after today, but these are the things that you will need to jot down and put on Post-it notes to be reminded of should you pursue the ferns as an interest. The life cycle, which we mentioned earlier, as you may have come into today's presentation knowing, starts with spores. And the spores we do not see. When you look at the underside of many fern fronds, you might see some bumps or lumps or spots or areas of a different coloration. And you may have been told by some well-meaning person in the past that those are the spores. Well, they're not. We don't see the spore. We breathe in the spores. We can even breathe out spores. We do it all the time. Spores everywhere, single cells, trying to land someplace to germinate and grow and fulfill this banana's life cycle, but we don't see them. This is the underside of one of the maiden ferns, and we can see this dried up, crusty, scabby mess. What we're looking at are collections of these. This is probably 20 times magnified, 25 times magnified. And what we are seeing here is this collection of little capsules with a zipper. Can you see the capsules? And you can see each of these capsules has a little zipper on it. Inside the capsules are the spores. They're single cells. They're incredibly small, yet incredibly resilient. Here's one of those capsules here with the zipper taken and stylized. Inside the capsule are the spores that are released one by the billion, that are carried by the air, that are carried by thermal movement of air, that are carried by electromagnetism. Static can move spores around. They can get trapped on the fur of something. There's all kinds of ways that spores can get away from the parent plant. And they're produced by the billion for an economy of scale, because only one spore produced by a fern in its 10-year life needs to germinate and grow into a fern in order for that to be a successful maintenance of a population. The spore lands, germinates, produces sex cells that then unite to form the next fern. The sporangium, here we have it coughing out the spores when they're ripe. Spores landing and growing into the separate plant. It's called a prothallus. It's only a couple of cell layers thick. You don't get to see these either. These show up in hidden places where they can have a thin layer of water that can facilitate the next part. When it ripens some sex organs and releases sperm into the environment that swims to find egg cells. So this is all happening kind of hidden away. When the egg and the sperm unite, they form the embryo that then grows into the next fern. So not really useful for identification, but worth being familiar with because it helps define what a fern technically is. And here we have that little sporling emerging from that prothallus that will then die away. Its job done. And the sporling will then grow into an adult fern to release spores and keep the cycle going. So how do we use this information to assist in the identification of an unknown fern? Well, here's a fern, underside of a leaf, underside of a frond, looking at the pinnae, which are attached to the rachis. Hear me using all these words that maybe we just heard. You can see areas along the underside of these pinnae that are ripe with the sporangia, okay? A spot of concentrated sporangia, are you following me? One spot of concentrated sporangia is called a sorus, a sorus. Together, when you're zooming out, you would say this frond has sori, ripened sori on its underside. So the sporangia are ripe. We've got this collection of sori. Each spot, each collection, each sorus may be protected by a thin layer of leaf tissue that's called an indusium. It may or may not be. The presence or absence of an indusium protecting and covering the sori, the individual sorus, the presence or absence of this protective flap could help with identification. Do you see where I'm going? That indusium could have a shape, a quality, a size, a configuration, a direction that it even opens. These can help with identification. These characteristics can help with identification. The sporangia themselves are going to look the same from fern to fern to fern to fern. This is a derived character that is what the original ancestral fern had that bestowed upon all living species of fern today. They're all going to have these sporangia that look the same. So using them is not important, but their position, their covering. Here we have a situation where as they develop, they're actually a dark black color. I don't know what fern this is. It's just a good example of how these weird characters can be useful for identification. They're shared by ferns, and there's only a few things that a fern can have different to another species. So it's these things. So here we have a cluster of sporangia containing the spores. This cluster happens to belong to the golden foot polypody. They're naked. There is no indusium covering the sori of these ferns. You see how they're just naked out there? Maybe you could see that. If you're familiar with the Phlebodium aureum, the golden foot polypody, you'll know, perhaps by memory, that they have these bare, naked sori. They're not covered by an indusium. Even in the absence of ripened sporangia in their respective sori, you can at least tell where they're going to be. So it's very often the case, if any of you are familiar with plant identification and trying to identify things in the field, you don't always get all the characters you need that minute. But with ferns, you can at least tell where those sori are going to be when they ripen. So you could describe where on the underside of the leaf these sori will be placed once they are mature. Do you see what I'm saying? These are the undeveloped primordial And here they are ripened. But even in this case, you could describe that they're not appearing on the margin of the leaf. They're not appearing on the central vein. They're appearing right in between. So I hope that makes sense. The swamp fern has and does us the great favor of being the only native fern that places its unprotected sporangia not in discrete little spots, but along the mid vein of a pinna, the only fern that does this. You flip one of these ferns over, you see this arrangement, you've arrived at a identification for the swamp fern. So you can see here the mid vein of the pinna is the location of these unprotected, segregated into the little dots. They're just out there on these mid veins, distinctive for the swamp fern. What is this one called? Bracken has a placement of sporangia along the margins. And it's actually the margin of the leaf division that curls under to protect those developing sporangia. So if the tripartite 3 times divided fern growing in an upland isn't enough to convince you that you're looking at bracken, the position of the sporangia might just hit that home run for you. In some ferns, they will produce one plant, one sporling will, upon maturity, produce 2 different types of leaves: a sterile leaf and a fertile leaf. A sterile frond and a fertile frond, the same sporling, 2 different kinds of leaves. One primarily for photosynthesis, the other primarily for reproduction. Such is the case in the netted chain fern, which is producing its fertile fronds right now. We have the fertile fronds being very upright so that it can throw clouds of spores a great distance. The sterile fronds, on the other hand, will not produce spores ever in their life cycle. They're just going to lie flat out, producing lots of sugar. Another example of fertile and sterile fronds are found in the cinnamon fern. The sterile fronds being the fern-looking leaves, and the fertile fronds being reduced to nothing more than great concentration of sporangia, giving them that distinctive cinnamon color. The giant leather fern produces sterile and fertile fronds, but you couldn't tell them apart. They're not morphologically distinctive until you flip them over and find that one leaf doesn't and never will produce sporangia. The other one, almost the entire frond is covered. The ontology of ferns is quite fun to watch as they uncurl. That's a condition that's called circinate vernation. Don't write that down. It's just a really cool expression. I happen to love it. So let's quickly breeze through some ferns that you might encounter on a jaunt through an area near you, park or preserve. That giant leather fern, Acrosticum danifolium, can produce individual leaves up to 12 feet long. So what we're looking at here in the left, a boardwalk, probably 9 or 10 feet above the ground where this fern is growing, that's a single leaf, a single frond, which is divided into individual leaflets. Do you remember what the leaflets are called? Penna. Well done. Yes, so we have these single leaves divided into little penna. Do you remember what the apenna are attached to? The rachis. Well done. And you can see this is a fertile frond. The underside is that bronzy, rusty color. One of the floating ferns, it's a true fern. It has sporangia. It's a vascular plant. It has an alternation of generations. It gets to be a fern. This one's called mosquito fern. It's a floating photosynthetic plant, so it's probably lumped into the duckweed group, but technically you're looking at a zola mosquito fern. responsible for an ice age on Earth. Thanks a lot for taking all the carbon dioxide out of the air. Mosquito fern. The swamp fern, which we looked at before, which has that distinctive placement of the sporangia along the mid-vein. Here it is emerging as a new leaf with beautiful bronze coloration and that distinctive placement. It's Telmata blechnum, cumbersome genus name, cerulatum, for the serrated pinna leaf margins, serrated and very sharp, serrated. Here's two light background, dark background. The swamp fern also has a very expressive terminal pinna. You see what I'm talking about? That final pinna at the very tip of the frond is kind of expressive. We locally jokingly say this is a fern that'll give you the finger, the swamp fern will. The climbing ferns, if you know them, you know better than to be moving them around. They literally have extremely long leaves that have the ability to coil and wind and climb. The various climbing ferns are very bad, very established in the Southeast, and very worth knowing how and when and why to eradicate your sphere of influence from the climbing ferns. There's a native climbing fern. Now that you know some fern words, perhaps you can look into how to tell the two apart. If you have the Boston fern or the tuber sword fern, it's worth learning how to identify this one based on some of the words and characteristics that we've discussed before. Eradicate. Plastic bag in the garbage. No composting. I mean, burning if you can. This is the only fern that you're going to find these underground tubers attached to the roots. Not always. That's not a guarantee. You won't always find these tubers. So there's some foliar characteristics that you'll need to perfect the identification of so you can make a proper identification. The sori are very kidney-shaped. And what we're looking at here is the underside of a leaf of the tuberous sword fern. The individual pinna overlap the rachis. So when you flip the frond over, you can't see the rachis. It's being overlapped by the pinnae. That's a good diagnostic. So that and the underground tubers can help solidify that identification. Cinnamon fern, unmistakable. One of our few clump-forming ferns that forms a vase-shaped. It has a single trunk. It will actually become a tree fern. In nature, its base is continually layered with leaf litter from above and its own old sterile fronds dying. So the crown tends to be more and more elevated. But if anything should happen to that duff that it's growing in, it would have actually a trunk. So the cinnamon fern, technically, though not obviously, a tree fern. The outside of breeding season, if you will, in the absence of those cinnamon-colored fertile fronds, where the pinnae, which this is one of the pinnatifid ferns, where the pinna reaches the rachis, there's often a tuft of golden hairs. We say that the cinnamon fern has hairy armpits. Where the little pinnae reach the rachis, there's a tuft of golden hairs often there. So in the absence of those fertile fronds, cinnamon-colored fertile fronds, you might be able to identify the cousin of the cinnamon fern, the royal fern, exaggerated in all respects, huge fronds, very well-spaced pinnules. This is a twice divided or a bipinnate fern with the fertile bits concentrated at the tip of an otherwise normal-looking frond. So only the tip, only the top third of this frond is given over to the reproductive. Here we have that kind of smoky, pale, buff-colored reproductive bit situated at the tip of an otherwise normal-looking frond. And you can see here the pinnules of a twice-divided frond being very well spaced out in the royal fern. the golden-foot polypody, whose private parts we peeked at earlier with their lovely golden naked sori, loves to grow in the boots or the old leaf bases of cabbage palm. It's almost like this fern evolved alongside this palm, because in nature, the palm boots are occupied by the golden-foot polypody. They're an excellent epiphytic plant that loves that concentrated duff and compost found in the old leaf bases. Here we have those golden spots, those naked sori of the golden-foot polypody, getting its name from this golden foot. The growing stem, remember, fern stems are very often underground or not obvious. They're not upright stems. They send their leaves upright to do the photosynthetic work. Here we have the leading end of the stem of the golden-foot polypody covered in these protective scales. They're large, woolly scales, and they're this beautiful golden color, giving its name the golden-foot polypody. Another epiphytic fern that has a leading stem that creeps along and grasps the surface of often a larger plant, making them an epiphyte, is the resurrection fern, our classic pinnatifid leaf feature, resurrecting because it dries out and then reanimates after a good rain. Have we come to time?
We're getting close, yes. So
Right.
yeah, if you're able to
Sure.
wrap it up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we looked at bracken before. It's the only fern you're going to find on the uplands. A couple of floating ferns, the maiden ferns, which there's a whole lot of. 16 in Florida, only 3 in our local area. They have this very acutely diminishing leaf tip. A lot of the maiden ferns do. Diagnostics can be had by looking at the pattern of the veins in the pinnae themselves. So studying ferns, studying their morphology, learning some of these words, investing in a really good hand lens that you can take into the field, doing some research at home, all ways to differentiate between the dozens, I'll say, different species of ferns that we have here in Florida. Here we have one of the maiden ferns with tuning fork style branching of the veins within the leaves. We mentioned the netted chain fern with its two different shaped leaves, a fertile and a sterile. Areoles, areas of complete circles defined by vein margins. The chain ferns, because of the situation of the reproductive sori in this kind of broken chain-like pattern on the underside of the frond. Often the Virginia chain fern will have a beautiful silver color on the underside as well. Ferns are not little weaklings. They don't need to be coddled. Here is the first emergence after a fire, and it's the Virginia chain fern emerging victorious out of the ashes of a local fire. So 300 million years, the ferns have figured it out. Please check out our book at the IFAS bookstore, where we compare often confused species of plants and animals. It's called This or That, pretty easy to find at UF IFAS. We have a YouTube channel where we go into a lot of natural history topics. It's UF IFAS Extension Pinellas County. If you want to hear more from us, that'd be great. Otherwise, I appreciate your attention this afternoon. Do drop a line, questions, comments, complaints, etc. And I appreciate the opportunity to present to you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a amazing presentation. We've had an awful lot of conversation on our platform. So thank you for that. And also there are lots of questions. So I don't know if you have time to stick around for a few minutes and answer some of those questions on the platform. That would be fantastic.
Of course.
If you're able to, we'd be really grateful.
Certainly.
There's some really interesting questions, and you've certainly captured people's imagination, and people are talking about how much they're learning. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to get up and visit you fairly soon. So I'll be in contact.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much. And we're going to jump on to our next presentation.
Everyone, welcome back. Wasn't that a lovely presentation? Just wanted to point out that, James works for Pinellas County Extension, and Pinellas County, the Board of County Commissioners, this past week was planning to vote to defund their extension office. So extension is a partnership between University of Florida IFAS and the county that it's in. And so usually there's a cost sharing agreement, and the county pays some and IFAS pays some. And then of course you get this great professional resource in your county for plant identification, water quality. Coastal counties get sea grant agents. Anyways, we love extension here at the Florida Native Plant Society, and so we wrote a letter to oppose this defunding and to support extension. And our local chapter also wrote a letter and spoke at the meeting, and they did a great job. And Pinellas County Extension was not defunded this week by Pinellas County. So James still has a job, and we're really happy about that. Yeah. So sorry that was a little rushed there at the end. Our conferences, we have our speaker slots and our times, and they just, we got to keep it moving because that next presenter has to get on and it has to go the way it has to go. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I don't see any comments or questions in the chat. Let me check my email really quick. Nope, not yet. We did have a comment from someone, Thursify 4645, who said that their neighbor planted bamboo along the lot line, and then the Boston ferns came in. They said that there's also a Chinese invasive vine too. So that's probably your two most common ferns that you'll notice if you're not out in natural areas. You're just kind of going around the standard Florida landscape now. You're gonna see Boston ferns, and you're gonna see Japanese climbing fern or old world climbing fern, because they're just extremely common these days. And so that's going to be your introduction to ferns in Florida. But we have a lot of great native ferns, as we saw in this lunch and learn. And of course, now that you know all of these, I hope you know. Are you ready for the quiz? Now that you know all of these terms, you can positively identify these ferns that you see, at least when they have spores. All right. Well, there's no further questions, so I don't want to announce we're doing our lunch and learn next month a little bit early. It's on December 12th because of PTO and the holidays. It's horticultural therapy with Alexa Heilman from Grow Hub, and so she presented at our most recent conference. And so I'm editing that and putting it together, but she will be available for questions. So she'll be on, I'll be referring questions to her during the lunch and learn, and you can ask your questions. You can email them to me ahead of time, or you can just ask them as the lunch and learn is happening, and we'll cover them at the end. And then hopefully Owen will be able to present in January or February. So I'll keep you guys updated. Thank you. Please, if you enjoyed the presentation, please give it a little like, a thumbs up, and you can subscribe if you're a YouTube user, and then you can get notified of Lily's Terminology Tuesday videos or our Lunch and Learn videos. So hope everyone is having a good holiday season and that you're getting out and enjoying this lovely weather that we're having throughout Peninsular Florida. I know there's not as many flowering plants to see, but it's good hiking weather. So, all right. See you guys next month.